Greetings and welcome to Conversations at Noon on the Connecticut Freedom Trail. I'm Tammy Denise. In August of 1995, the General Assembly established the Connecticut Freedom Trail to tell the stories of struggle and dignity of the Black and African American communities for freedom. A year later, in September 1996, the Freedom Trail opened in 50 towns with about 30 sites. Today, we are upwards of 170 sites and still growing. Our eventual goal is to have one site in at least one site in each of the 169 municipalities here in Connecticut. The Freedom Trail is under the oversight of the Amistad Committee. Today's speaker, Mr. Joseph McGill, is going to speak about sleeping with the ancestors and why is it an educational benefit to sleep in these slave-dwelling extincts. Now, he is a native of Kingstree, South Carolina. He is the founder of the Slave Dwelling Project and a history consultant for Magnolia Plantation in Charleston, South Carolina. By arranging for people to sleep in extinct slave dwellings, the Slave Dwelling Project has brought much-needed attention to these often neglected structures that are vitally important to the American-built environment. Mr. McGill has conducted over 250 plus overnights in approximately 150 different sites in 25 states and the District of Columbia. He has interacted with the descendants of both the enslaved communities and of the enslavers associated with the antebellum historic sites. Mr. McGill is a Civil War reenactor who participates in living history presentations and lectures. Mr. McGill also holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in Professional English from South Carolina State University and is a co-author of the book, Sleeping with the Ancestors: How I Followed the Footprints of Slavery. Before we have Mr. McGill speak, just a quick housekeeping. If you have any comments or questions, please feel free to put them in the question and answer box on whatever social media platform you are following. So, ladies and gentlemen, my good friend, Mr. Joseph McGill, take it away.
Hello. Hi, Tammy. Thank you for the opportunity to be on this show. It's always a pleasure to hang out with you. I usually come up to New London and we go to the Hempstead houses and spend the night in the Hempstead houses along with others. And we do that program commemorating Juneteenth. We've gone also to Virginia and we did a program there. We were trying to get you out to Lexington, but you are so busy. We couldn't get you there, but we're going to try to make it happen in other places also. Yes, my name is Joseph McGill. I am the founder of the Slave Dwelling Project. I'm going to turn around here a little bit, folks. Hopefully you can see my face. I'm gonna turn around. I'm gonna turn the camera. Hopefully, I don't know what you can see in the background. It might be a little difficult for you to see some buildings in the background. Those buildings are slave cabins. I'm at Magnolia Plantation and Gardens right now. That's where I work full time. And I get to talk to folks about, sleeping in slave dwellings. And I get to talk about the history of Magnolia Plantation and Gardens. Um, the slave dwelling project is a very simple concept. I find slave dwellings wherever they are in the United States, and I ask the owners of those places if I could spend the night in those spaces, because once upon a time you could come to a site like this, and very seldom would you hear about the slave dwellings like you see in the background there. They would be very quick to tell you about the nice, beautiful big house, the architectural significance of the big house, the vaulted ceilings, the place settings, all the people who inhabited those spaces. But very seldom would they tell you about the people they enslaved, or if they told you about the people that they enslaved, they'll tell you that the enslaved people were happy and the enslavers were benevolent. None of that stuff's true. Um, uh, I often hear from people when I'm talking to them here about the slavery that existed here on this plantation. The number one question that I get is, where are the Draytons? The Draytons, Drayton. They were the owners of this plantation. Were they good slave owners? And that's the number one question. It's the number one question because these people are under that misconception of what they've been taught. They were taught what I was taught, that enslaved people were happy and their enslavers were benevolent. And that's why the slave dwelling project exists. It rights a wrong. It lets the folks know that the narrative at these historic sites need to be corrected if they are not already. Now, more recently, there are those places out there that are doing a better job. But it was because there were so many failures out there, so many sites telling some fairy tale, sugar coated version of history, that I started in 2010 sleeping in slave dwellings. And this place was the very first place that I slept in a slave dwelling. I've slept in these cabins here the most of any. But 2010, May of 2010, I woke up in one of those slave cabins that I'm looking at right now. I was not that familiar with this property. I just knew that I had this crazy idea that that if I could sleep in one of those cabins, I could bring attention to the fact that these cabins exist, and they need to be interpreted and talked about also. I was a part of a team of inspectors inspecting the work that was being done when these cabins were being restored. And I said out loud to someone on the team or someone in the chain of command that I would like to sleep in one of these cabins when the work is done. Well, they heard it, sent it on up the chain of command. The boss here at the time, Tom Johnson, thought it was a great idea, and he made it happen. He spoke to the family, and he made it happen. But before he made it happen, I acquired a list from the State Historic Preservation Office because I knew that if Tom here thought this was a great idea, the people in the State Historic Preservation Office would probably think it was a great idea also. So I acquired that list. I explained to them what I was trying to do. I was trying to bring attention to these sites, these slave dwellings. And I thought that sleeping in them would be a good way to do that. And that idea came about because I'm also a Civil War reenactor. And being a Civil War reenactor when it was more popular than it is now, I would go to historic sites and we would do these Civil War battles. And after the Civil War battles, we would be allowed to still stay on the site, have these campfires and these conversations around these campfires. But I thought sleeping in these places would be the best thing to do. So I got that list and I started sleeping in places in the state of South Carolina. It was my intent just to stay here in the state of South Carolina because that's where my limited resources would take me. I was employed by the National Trust for Historic Preservation at the time. And again, that's where my limited resources would take me, within the boundaries of the state of South Carolina. So my very first night sleeping in one of these slave cabins, not being familiar with the property, I woke up on Mother's Day of 2010 and I took a walk, not knowing where I was going. I went down this road, if you can see right behind me here. And I went around that curve, and I kept going, and I came to the cemetery, not knowing that cemetery was there at the time. And I saw these grave markers. I saw that it was an active cemetery. People were being buried there up until the 1990s. I saw then some people were born enslaved and died free. That was interesting to me, to see their headstones. But then I saw nothingness. I saw indentions in the earth, and that proved to be the graves of those formerly enslaved people who were buried there. At the time they were buried, their graves may have been marked with something, but here's what we have to take into account in assessing that information is, these people were not allowed to read and write. It was illegal for them to read or write. So they were not going to leave any headstones. And of course, that enslaver was not going to pay for a headstone for them after he had stolen their labor all of their lives. So those graves were unmarked. But it was those graves, those indentions in the earth, that I knew I was about to embark on this journey of finding these slave dwellings wherever they are, and spending a night in them. So I did get through this particular first day. Second stay was someplace close to here, Bluffton, South Carolina. My third stay was back in this area. I went to McLeod Plantation here in the Charleston, South Carolina area. Then I went to Hobcar in Georgetown, South Carolina. Now, luckily for me, when I was employed by the National Trust for Historic Preservation, I was responsible for two states, Alabama and Louisiana. Once this project had started, once I started sleeping in these places, the media got attention to what I was doing. NPR published a piece on it. The first big media attention came with the Charlotte Observer when they published a piece on it. One of the reporters came and spent the night with me at Hobcar Barony, and he wrote a piece. Because of his piece that he wrote, NPR found it, and after the publicity, it was like that genie was out of the bottle. That bell could not be unrung. People just started thinking it was a popular thing, and it was a great thing to do. I started getting invitations from other states, and I told them of my intention just to do this thing for 1 year in the state of South Carolina. And I said to them, if they wanted to make it happen, you're going to have to provide the resources to make it happen. And boy, did they start to provide the resources to make it happen. That second year was a lot of out-of-state stays. That second year was a big learning curve for me, because I had to come away from that place, that limited education that I had about slavery, because I had slavery relegated to plantations in the South. And because I had slavery relegated to plantations in the South, I was missing a lot right here in plain sight. The city of Charleston, the historic city of Charleston, South Carolina, where I am right now. It's within that city, within the city limits, there are so many slave dwellings that interprets urban slavery. Urban slavery was not a thing to me, 13 years ago when I started this project. But I've stayed in lots of sites in the city of Charleston that are not interpreted. At least 13 years ago when I started this thing, they were not talking about these places. They were talking about the nice, beautiful big house that fronts the streets, and all that. But they weren't talking about the area in back where the enslaved people made all that possible, cooked the food. Nor were they talking about who built those places, whose labor was stolen to make all that happen. They weren't talking about those fingerprints in the bricks that a lot of people not talk about. They weren't talking about those beams that forms the support structure for that building. Those marks in those beams, those ads and axe marks in those beams. They weren't talking about that. They weren't talking about those letters, those parts of the letters that talked about what happened to the enslaved population. Maybe they ran away, or maybe they had to discipline them, or maybe they will consider selling them, or maybe they just bought another allotment of enslaved people, or maybe they had to pay taxes on enslaved people. They weren't talking about all those things, in the narrative and what they were telling these folks. And the city of Charleston weren't marketing that aspect of the story. They're doing a better job now. And the slave dwelling project could take some credit for that. But since our inception, 13 years ago, we have evolved. We do a lot of great things now. Part of our evolution is now conversations. We do conversations around campfires. We picked up on the fact that from my Civil War days, we were going around these campfires and having these conversations, getting into the minds of Confederate reenactors. And sometimes that's a scary place to be. But what that taught me was the conversations were important. So now, as a part of the Slave Dwelling Project and what we do, we almost always, when we go to these places, we have these campfire conversations. We strike up a campfire, and we just sit around and talk. We talk about things, guys. We talk about those things that people don't usually talk about amongst people who don't look and think like them. We talk about slavery and the legacy that is left on this nation. And in these conversations, we talk about white supremacy, white privilege, historical trauma, Confederate monuments. Should they stay or should they go? Weddings on plantation. That's been a very popular subject matter. And the matter of weddings on plantation usually falls along racial lines. It's something I talk about here to this audience when I work here. And it's always a racial thing. For the white folks who engage in that conversation, they see no problem with it. Most of the black folks who engage in that conversation, it's a problem. Again, the DNA compels you to think differently about how these stories are told or what these spaces are used for. Also, a part of our evolution is we do living history now. I'm only one person, and I can only do so much. I know my lane. I know where I'm most effective in telling the stories or honoring the enslaved ancestors, and I try to stay in that lane. Well, our living historians are storytellers, are demonstrators. A lot of times people could go to sites like this and they could see things being demonstrated that would have been done historically, like brick making and blacksmithing and cooking. Well, at some of these sites, once upon a time, and it's still the case, people would be demonstrating these things who are white. Historically, that was not the case. So what we have done, we have gotten a group of reenactors, Tammy's one of them, that we have gathered, and we go to these spaces and we do these demonstrations, these living history events for them. And we sometimes are the only time some sites can have, black interpreters at their site. And most of the time it goes over well. There've been a few flops. Sometimes the audience just aren't ready for us. They're just accustomed to hearing things the way that they've heard things. They want to come to these places and live out that fairy tale existence that's in their head. They want to hear the sugar-coated version of what went on here, the Gone with the Wind version of what went on in these places. But through our living history, we get to show the agency of our enslaved ancestors. Despite what the laws said that they were, despite what the owners thought of them as, these people were still human. And because these people were still human, we get to interpret their agency. We get to prove to our people of present day, our black folks of present day, that we come from a proud past. And we should be their representative, and we do. We are indeed their representative. Another part of our evolution is that since our existence, in our 13 years of existence, we've done 7 conferences, slave dwelling project conferences. They've all been in southern states. Well, in 2024, we're going to be having our 8th conference in a northern state to be named. And Connecticut is on the short list of a possibility of where the conference will be here, will be held. Hopefully, I'll know more this weekend. We got a big board meeting here in Charleston, South Carolina. We're going to be making some decisions along those lines as to where the 2024 conference will be. So that's a part of that's also a part of our evolution. And because of it's a part of our evolution. We're letting folks know that this thing called chattel slavery that was a part of this nation had a very large footprint. So generally, the slave dwelling project, now we're in our 13th year of existence, and we've been doing some great things. We are evolving, continuing to evolve. One thing that we'll be concentrating on in 2024 and beyond is the conversations. Some of these places that we're going to be visiting in 2024 and beyond aren't necessarily antebellum sites. Slavery may not have existed at some of these sites, but the conversations that we have is so relevant, it could be applied in a lot of places. One thing that we need to think about is even after emancipation, even after freedom, a lot of folks, when they talk about the word reparations, they tie it to that period in our history. I remind people that as far as the United States is concerned, in reparations for Black folks, when slavery ended in Washington, D.C. in April of 1861, reparations were paid to the owners for loss of property. Or was that April of 1862? I'll have to check that. Reparations were paid to the owners for loss of property. Same as when slavery ended in England. Reparations were paid to the owners for loss of property. So I try to make them think beyond slavery and those things that continued to disenfranchise us. Even after freedom in 1865, those things that continued to disenfranchise us were, of course, the KKK, lynchings, convict labor, redlining, poll taxes, Jim Crow laws, black codes, and of course massacres. So we help people connect dots when we talk about the history of our enslaved ancestors. So we bring that attention. We honor our enslaved ancestors in those ways. So now, guys, I've been fortunate enough to, for the last 13 years, be a part of honoring the ancestors in the manner that I do by performing a simple act, by sleeping in slave dwellings. Very simple act. But one thing that I learned very early on in the process, I had an ex-coworker, Tanya Bowers is her name. She said, "Joe, sleeping in these places is good, but you gotta document it. You can't just sleep in it and just move on. You gotta document these things." I said, "Well, Tanya, how am I going to do that?" She said, "You gotta write a blog." I said, "Tanya, I'm not a writer like that." She said, "Write 500 words. I'll help you." So I struggled. To get 500 words. I wrote it and got published. And then I'd do another stay and I'd do my 500 words, still struggling with it. But I got to the point where I set for my own goal, set for myself a goal of 1,000 words. I was writing 1,000 words. And now, luckily for me, Tanya was quite adamant about me doing that. And I did it. And because I did it, it's now that material has been used for the book that is currently published. In June of this year, The book was published called Sleeping with the Ancestors: How I Followed the Footprints of Slavery. And because the book is now published, in addition to the sleepovers that we do, still do, I still plan to do sleepovers, but now I may have more sleepovers behind me than I have ahead of me, but we still do that. Um, the co-author of the book, his name is Herb Frazier. One thing that I had to figure out was, I do what I do. I'm kind of a hands-on. I work in the trenches, and do the things that I do in the manner that I do them. But I'm not the writer. I'm not a writer that can keep people reading, wanting to go to the next chapter. I'm not a writer like that. Herb Frazier, a good friend of mine. I met him very early on in the process. In fact, I met him working here. Herb and I used to be co-workers right here at Magnolia Plantation and Gardens. He was the marketing person. He's a journalist. He's worked at a few places, and up until this book, he was 3-time published prior to that. Um, so he and I determined that it was time to do the book. So it took us about 2.5 years to write the book, and using the material that I had already established, the blogs, because in those blogs, others were giving their input also. So we use that as our source. We pulled out the narratives, the slave narratives, because in the 1930s, formerly enslaved people were still alive, and they were interviewed. Those interviewed are now what is known as the slave narrative. So we use that source. We consulted with some of the places that we stayed, some of the people who stayed in these spaces with us. So all that is now in that book. That book, called the Sleeping with the Ancestors: How I Followed the Footprints of Slavery. And I know I probably got some of you guys busy. I'm just moving around as I speak to you. But that's the Slave Dwelling Project. That's what we do. Um, we have a website. The website is slavedwellingproject.org, www.slavedwellingproject.org. We are a nonprofit organization. It is Giving Tuesday, guys. If you feel the spirit, go onto the website, and you can make a donation on this Giving Tuesday. Hopefully, you're still in a Thanksgiving spirit. We just commemorated Thanksgiving, although that's a whole can of worms. I don't want to get in all that, the history of Thanksgiving and all that. We're not here for this. We're here to talk about the Slave Dwelling Project and the book. So I'm going to yield to my host, get further instructions to see if we can go to Q&A.
All right, sir. Thank you so very much. And thank you for leaving us a little bit more time where we can actually have conversations and talk about some of the things in the books, The Slave Dwelling Project. I'm going to say off the top, my favorite page is page 304. And if you haven't gotten the book, that's a reason to go get it, so you can see why page 304 is my favorite. But thank you so very much. I really appreciate the effort that you put into this. And I love the niche that you carved out for yourself, because again, that was living history in front of us that we just took for granted, walked past. I remember you and Mr. Terry James, where you told of the instance where you slept inside of a dwelling and you literally could hear people walking past, and they had no idea that you were there, that extinct actually existed. So I think it's very important, the work that you do, and I hope that you have more in front of you than behind you, but I definitely get it. And looking forward to being able to continue on this journey with you. It was such a privilege last year to go to Belle Grove, President Madison's sister's home. It was a pleasure to be there last year to bring Elizabeth Keckley back to the Shenandoah Valley. So that was really cool, and looking forward to doing more. We do have a couple of comments and questions before we go any further with our commentary. Our good friend Nicole Thomas says that this is going to be such a good show, and that she adores the work and that you are doing.
Yeah.
She also says she's working on getting you in Connecticut as well as I. So it's going to happen. We're going to make it happen.
Beautiful. Yeah, Nicole is an employee at the Hempstead houses. And she and I and you, no, you weren't there when the bat
No, I
was
was not
shared.
there for the bat story. Thank goodness.
Okay.
Y'all did not
Yeah,
want me there for that.
yeah. That bat shared that space with us. We let the bat have the space, and we relocated elsewhere in that house that night. But the thing about the Hempstead houses is that I've got tenure there, as in, I've been coming back there for year after year after year.
Yeah.
And you guys got it early, doing the right thing by the space. There's that book For Adam's Sake,
Yes.
and all that he experienced as an enslaved person. And it helped to educate me on some of the slavery that took place in those northern states. I get a lot of pushback from people when I tell them what I do, and then I tell them the places that I go. When I insert the fact that I've gone to northern states to apply what I do, there's a lot of pushback for several reasons. Some folks are just unaware that slavery existed in northern states. Some folks are adamantly want to keep it a southern thing, and don't want to take on their responsibility for how their states, even after the revolution, uh, abolished slavery legislatively, they were still complicit, because in these northern states were the banks holding the mortgages on people's lives, the insurance holding policies of insurance on enslaved people's lives. The ships, we talked about the possibility of me spending a night in the Amistad. The ships that were owned by Northerners and being built in those northern states, and those factories that were adding value to the cotton that was being picked. So we get to interpret that at these conferences, and that's what we're going to be concentrating on at the upcoming conference. The slavery that took place in northern states.
Yes. Like you, Joe, the pushback is real. I worked at a museum for almost 20 years, and to try to get those stories told was like pulling teeth, and it was such pushback from the institution itself. But I did do a tour once for a group of seniors, and they grew up here in Connecticut. And I'll never forget this one particular senior. She comes to me, she was just in utter shock and disbelief. She had tears in her eyes, and I felt bad. I'm like, but why are you crying? What's going on? And she said, I grew up here in Connecticut all my life, and I'm almost 80 years old, and I did not know slavery existed in Connecticut. And the pushback for her was, it was shattering her world. It was shattering her view of what she thought life really was. And like you said, the Gone with the Wind version is what most people are used to seeing and hearing. And then you come along and you shatter that myth, and it leaves people sort of stuck, and leaves them in utter shock. But the reason we do what we do is to try to get them to move from that position of stuck and to move forward and to understand. Let's see, we have a couple of questions here. Christine Jules says, what was it like staying in these dwellings? What did you feel?
Well, the very first night in this place where I'm standing right now, I'm looking at the cabin where I stayed. It was a challenge. It was a challenge to get to sleep, because if the Wi-Fi was more reliable out there, I'd go out there and I'd take you through the cabins. But I don't want to break the connection by trying to do that. But when I slept in that cabin, it was hard to get to sleep, because there was a limb that, when the wind blew, it interacted with the top of the cabin, and I had to get up about 5 times, to convince myself that that was what I was hearing, that limb interacting with that roof. But you think about things. You think about enslaved people in those spaces, the fact that their labor was being stolen, um, the fact that that place in that space was probably the most serene time of their lives. But even that serenity could be interrupted by the desire of the enslaver, especially for young ladies of that period. Those enslavers had access That's why in that period in our history, there are so many mulatto children born, most of non-consensual relationships. So you think about those things. You think about running away. You think about bloodhounds, and the bloodhounds that you see today. Were those bloodhounds descended from bloodhounds that chased black folks? You know, back in the day. You think about the dangers involved in working on a rice plantation. This place is teeming with alligators. They're the poisonous snakes. The biggest threat to them was mosquitoes. Sickle cell anemia is the defense mechanism against malaria. You think about leeches and snapping turtles and all these things that our enslaved ancestors had to contend with on these plantations. And you come with the knowledge that you have. You thought about Charleston, South Carolina, being the number one place where enslaved people came in. Of the 12 million people who made it across the Atlantic Ocean alive, only 500,000 were shipped here to the United States. But of those 500,000, 40% of those were shipped here through the Charleston, South Carolina harbor. So, you come in with that kind of knowledge and you think about those things, and eventually you go to sleep.
Yeah, that brings up the historical trauma piece of it, where, like you said, when you're thinking about that stuff, we literally do get the PTSD, even though we were not there physically, because it's been scientifically proven that our DNA has been altered because of that historical trauma. So it is very real, and it's not something we can just get over or sweep it under the rug. It is something that has to be dealt with, and that's the issue that a lot of places are still having. And like Nicole says here, a lot of people still have not apologized for some of those enslavement policies that they had in place to continue to oppress our ancestors. Dr. Eric Hurst wants to know, have you visited the Aldie Mill and Oatlands Plantation in Loudoun County or Loudoun County, Virginia, or Pittsburgh Manor in Sleepy Hollow, New York?
Loudoun. I visited there, stayed in the big house. Loudon. I stayed there. I think they're still open to the public, as far as I know. Now I heard that they kind of concentrate more on weddings and things of this nature. Loudon, Phillipsburg Manor. Yeah, I stayed there. The mill at Phillipsburg. In Sleepy Hollow. Yeah, I spent the night there. And I think you named the third one. I don't think I stayed at the third.
Let's see. The third one was Oatlands Plantation. At
No?
Aldie Mill. Sorry.
Yeah, I don't know if I stayed in that one.
Okay. Let's see. Jennifer wants to know, are you finding that the dwellings are similar to each other? So when you go from dwelling to dwelling, what are some of the similarities, or are there similarities?
Usually if they're made for field hands, they're usually duplexes, as these are. The chimney's in the middle, and there's usually a wall separating the spaces for field hands. For the field hand, those enslavers were just providing the bare minimum. They weren't all about creature comforts and all that. Now, if these dwellings were for the people who worked in the house, these dwellings were usually made of the material the big house is usually made of, because that enslaver is flaunting his wealth.
Mm-hmm.
So now the people weren't treated any better. Well, I'll take that back. If you're my cook, I probably wouldn't sell your child or strip you bare and beat you in front of an audience. So it may be in that sense. If you want to classify that as better treatment, so be it. But they usually use the material that was available at the time. If you go in the state of Virginia, you'll see a lot of field stone, because you're clearing these fields so that they can grow whatever you want to grow, probably tobacco if you're in Virginia. But you take these stones out of these fields, you don't throw them away. That's why you see a lot of rock fences. That's why you see a lot of these buildings, built of fieldstone in that area. Now, if you're on the frontier, it's going to be a cabin. It's going to be a log cabin, and sometimes these log cabins are just as they or when you cut it off of the tree or cut down a tree, they don't do the squaring of these things, and they just caulk it as necessary. Sometimes you take a step beyond that and you make them square, or make them beams and things that you have to do the proper maintenance to, or the work to make it that. So if you're on the frontier, chances are it's wood. There are a lot of places where you find brick slave cabins. A lot of times in these operations, they make the bricks right there on the site. The same bricks, the same pit that they use, or the same mud that they use to build the big house. They'll use some of that same some of those same bricks to build the slave cabins. Also, again, if it's near the big house, you want it to look nice. So there's that. There are places where I've gone, the coasts. Some that are made of tabby, and that's a combination of oyster shells, sand, and lime. So yeah, I've seen all kinds of materials used for slave cabins. Now, a lot of time in these northern states, the slavery was a little more intimate, such as the Hempstead houses. They were in you guys call it a garret. I call it an attic. Um, so they're in those spaces. Now you take a state like New York. In New York abolished slavery in 1799 on paper, but last person freed in New York was 1827. In 1703, 40% of New Yorkers were slave owners. When South Carolina seceded from the Union on December 20th of 1860, for a brief moment, New York considered seceding also because of its financial investment in the institution of slavery. But I said that to say this. In those northern states, again, in 1703, 40% of New Yorkers were slave owners. That slavery was a little more intimate. In other words, there are a lot more people owning less people. Leading into the Civil War in 1861, the 1860 census, approximately 703,000 people in the state of South Carolina. There were approximately 703,000 people in the state of South Carolina. And of that 703,000 people, approximately 402,000 of them were enslaved. So the enslaved population in 1860 in the state of South Carolina was greater than that of the white population. There was one other state in this nation with a similar ratio, and that was the state of Mississippi. The first two states to secede from the Union, South Carolina, and then Mississippi. Oh yeah, Columbus, that's your state.
Yes, that is my hometown, Columbus, Mississippi. Yes. You had to bring that up.
Well, hey, that's fair.
Hey. Eric says that Aldi is around the corner from the Oatland, so you may have got to see that as a tour.
Yeah, they took me by there. Yes.
Okay, so that's where that is. Ken Johnston says, as someone who has traced the footsteps of Harriet Tubman literally by walking to Canada, he would sometimes feel spiritual energies along some trails used by freedom seekers. And he wants to know, did you ever feel the energies of ancestors in some of the dwellings?
And I don't try to. You know why? Because I gotta keep my mind capable of going to the next place.
Yeah.
When I started 13 years ago, I used to get phone calls from ghost hunting outfits, and I know ghosts and spirits, the way he's describing it is different, two different things. But I told them, I shooed them away. I said, look, no, this project is not about that. And then I get those who want to feel those things. And I said, it's okay. We used to do libations at these gatherings very early on. Don't do that anymore either. But it's not my intent to try to feel that. But anyone who wants to come along and want to feel those things, I don't discourage it. As long as they're not out there, some gimmick looking for ghosts and trying to, trying to treat this project that way. We just don't go there. We don't want to do that. But I'm not saying all those things aren't there, because they are. It's just that I don't try to disturb it, tap into it, or none of that.
Yeah, gotcha. Jennifer wants to know, have you done any research on gardens, and are they attached to the dwellings or community gardens if you have?
Well, gardens, yeah. There's a thing that I'm working on now. There's a preservation organization right here in Charleston. Historic. Well, there are two preservation organizations. There's the Historic Charleston Foundation. There's the Preservation Society. We right back in 2017, 2018, prior to COVID, we were doing tours because those two organizations, they do tours every year and they concentrate on the nice, beautiful big house. Well, um, the Slave Dwelling Project and Historic Charleston Foundation, we started a tour. We were concentrating only on on spaces of the enslaved. But with that, comes the interpretation of the gardens also. So we kind of look at the gardens on the periphery. It's like kind of like the way we treat the graveyards. We kind of have that on the periphery of our mission because there's always those other entities that can do a whole lot better job than the slave dwelling project and all that. But we try to bring notice to those gardens as much as possible. Just as these folks like to celebrate these nice, beautiful, architecturally significant houses, there are those who are just as much interested in the gardens. We want the complete history of those gardens. They call this place here Magnolia Plantation and Gardens. Um, but we want folks to know that it was the enslaved ancestors who created all this nice, beautiful garden because, the enslaver's wife wanted a nice, beautiful garden, and the enslaved people created this garden for her.
Awesome. Ken Johnson says, in regards to the conference for 2024, he recommends Niagara Falls in New York. So, Ken, you got to tell us, do you have the connections that we can reach out to in that area? And let's see if Ken can get back to us with that. A gentleman by the name of Bill Warner Prouty, sir, I hope I'm pronouncing your hyphenated name correctly. He says the Underground Railroad Museum in Cincinnati has a barn from Anderson, Kentucky, where the enslaved were held before they were marched to the Deep South for sale. Do you know about that?
I do. In fact, thank you for that reminder. I was given a tour here about a month ago, and I mentioned that I have not yet gone to Ohio, and one of the visitors gave me the information I needed to contact the person to make it happen. Now, I got to do that. I went on their website and I typed in my wish. They haven't responded to me yet, but they're just coming off of Thanksgiving vacation. But I need to go ahead and call that number because I want to add more states to the portfolio. Right now, there's only 25 states in the portfolio. I was supposed to add Michigan into the portfolio, but then COVID happened and never got it reinstated onto the population. But yes, I'm familiar with that particular place in that museum, and I just got to follow up and do what I need to do to make it happen.
Got it. And you will, sir. Ken says he does have the information. So, Ken, when we somehow or another, we got to connect to make sure I get your contact information and I will reach out to you so that we can put Niagara Falls on the list of possibilities to make it happen for 2024. Now, Joseph McGill and we have been working together for a number of years. And one of the things that we do is we do a program for the fifth grade level in New London where we get to do what we do in front of the Zoom. We started this in COVID, as a matter of fact, before it was live, and then COVID happened, and we wanted to keep it going, and we wanted to know how can we make this possible with the bands and the mask and everything. And so good old handy dandy Zoom came into play for us, and so we were able to continue that process of being able to educate the fifth graders in the New London area. And that has been quite productive. So, Joe, have you done any more of those type educational things with the Slave Dwelling Project, or is that something you're still working on to make it more widespread?
Well, what I've been doing lately, I go to where the young minds are. I'm on TikTok now.
That's cool.
For all you youngsters out there who may be tuned in, you can find me at Joseph McGill 542 or Drive By Schooling. is what I also call the piece. So I do TikTok. We do also we do Instagram, and I'm most active on Facebook. I get in trouble a lot on Facebook, but most active on Facebook. I think community guidelines and algorithms and what's the other one? Community guideline algorithm and artificial intelligence. I think there's some a little racist tinge in there somewhere. But so yeah, we try to every now and then I go live and we try to get folks to tap in through that way. It's been a while since I've gone live um, on Facebook, but there's some of those in the future also.
Well, it's the kind of good trouble that what Mr. Lewis spoke about is that good trouble
Yes.
you get into on social media. Jennifer Busa says, "Thank you, Joe. Very informative presentation. She really appreciates that." And, we're almost out of time. We got time for a couple more questions or comments if anyone wants to jump in before we end the program. Joe, I really appreciate your Slave Dwelling Project book. I really appreciate it because it brings to light a lot of the work that you've done, but it also brings to light those extant dwellings that a lot of times people just ignore, and they don't realize the importance of those buildings that's been standing for decades, hundreds of years, decades, and they have a story to tell. And I appreciate you bringing these stories to the fore in this book. If you have not grabbed your copy of this, whether on Kindle, hard copy, paperback, please do so, because this book is very informative and it is very encouraging, and it's one of those things that helps us to keep our narrative in the forefront from our point of view and from our lens, which has oftentimes been neglected and forgotten, but we now have that opportunity to do that. So I thank you, sir. And Mr. Herb Frazier, you are definitely thought of as well. So thank you very much for that as well. Rhonda Singer says, "Great presentation and thank you." Let's see. Joe, can you talk about how climate change is impacting some of the surviving slave dwellings? Oh, excellent question, Ken.
Yeah. Well, those places I'm gonna have to give up their space real soon because this other group is coming, but
Okay.
we still got a few minutes. We're good. Um, so those places on the coast might be affected the most. There's some places that are made of tabby. Those places that are made of tabby that are on the coast, they are most affected by climate change, and that may dictate that because of erosion and climate change, some of these places may not exist within the decades to come. Maybe in our lifetime we may be losing some of these things, and we got to also consider the weather itself, even beyond the coastline, and all the possibilities there of tornadoes getting stronger and more frequent. A lot of places are now in harm's way. You may recall that a few years ago there was a tornado that hit Selma, Alabama, and all the history there. That could have been threatened by that tornado that hit that place. And we know that Florida is bullseye for hurricanes. I've stayed at one place in Florida so far. I want to go to other places in the state of Florida, but because of the threat of hurricanes coming and wiping some of those places out, that is a threat. So we have to pay attention to the desire to want to do everything within our powers to help these places still on the landscape. If that means doing those things to lessen the impact of our presence here on this earth, our carbon footprint, anything that can help the climate protect this earth in the manner that it should be protected, I think we should do all we can to do that. And the Slave Dwelling Project is on board with all that.
Awesome. Joe, I know you have to move. Is there any way we can keep you on for a few minutes longer? Because we got more questions and they're great questions. Is there any way we can give you a moment to move? Because we can extend this program
Okay.
for you to answer those questions.
Well, well, I'm moving now. I'm moving now
Okay.
towards the cabin. Now, if we lose the the feed, that you'll know why. But
Okay.
I'm moving out of their way
Okay.
right now.
Let's see. A couple of suggestions to go. Mariana suggests you go to Puerto Rico. She thinks that's a great place to go. A question
Especially
from
during the winter.
exactly. I'm with you on that one. Question from Rebecca. She says, I'm curious if in your travels, have you ever encountered your own family history?
Uh, you know, no, I haven't. I think the closest I may have gotten to that is going to Georgetown County. I stayed on the a place Mansfield plantation on the Black River. The Black River runs through my home county, my hometown of Kingstree, South Carolina. So that's probably the closest I've gotten, but nothing direct. Somebody did some archaeological. I'm sorry. Somebody did some genealogical research for me, and took my my folks back to 1842 in Williamsburg County. But that's about the extent of what I know about my enslaved ancestors. But as far as a place that I can associate with them, no.
Okay. Mr. Bill Warner Prouty, he is recommending Confederates in the Attic. And I'm guessing he is associated with that book. If not, I apologize, but he is recommending Confederates in the Attic. Then
Now,
we have,
does
huh?
Mr. Bill know that I'm in that book?
That that might be why he's saying it.
Okay. Yeah.
um, then there's a question from Terry. She says, I listened to the Grading the Nutmeg podcast and wonder now if any sites have refused your sleeping there for any reason, and just curious how open this idea is to everyone. So have you ever been refused the idea of sleeping in a dwelling?
Yeah. I've been trying to get into Beauvoir. That's the home of Jefferson Davis. Um, they,
Um,
I haven't slept there yet. I'm trying to get into the White House. We
ah,
built that too. That's the ultimate. I certainly want to get there. That hasn't, that hasn't happened yet. And I've reached out, telling them I want it to happen. Some places I finally got a sleepover at Mount Vernon, George Washington's place. But from the time I made the request until the time it happened, it was five years had passed.
wow.
Um, there have been places that told me, no initially, but then, they found out that I was sincere about my intent, and then they came back around and allowed me to do that. Sleep in some of these places. There's a slave cabin on the campus of the University of South Carolina, right on the horseshoe, right behind the president's house. Um, no, I got to know there. There's slave cabins at the University of Alabama. Haven't slept there yet. Francis Marion University, right here in South Carolina, Florence, South Carolina. Haven't slept at any of those places that I've been told no. So yeah, there are a lot of places who aren't ready for this, who cater more to their constituents, and want their constituents to have a more comfortable version of what went on at these places.
Well, I'm just going to say this, put my dibs in right now. If you get that invitation to the White House, Elizabeth Keckley has got to go with you because that was her stomping ground. She was there. Well, Eric Hurst says he is looking forward to the virtual lecture that you will be doing at Center Church in February of 2024.
Oh
So,
yeah, that's
yes,
right.
yes, that's who Dr. Hurst is with asking those questions. So he is looking forward to your virtual presentation in February. Well, my friend, we have made it to the end of the hour that you did not think you would be able to fulfill. So I appreciate you. And you even got the cabins in the backdrop before the end. So thank you. That looks awesome. Great backdrop. I look forward to our future adventures together. I thank you so very much for your time. And again, you're always welcome to come back if you have new adventures to talk to us about. So thank you, Mr. Joseph McGill, for taking the time. We really appreciate you, sir. All right, everyone. Thank you so very much for joining us on this at Conversations at Noon today. It was a great adventure to be a part of. This was sleeping with the ancestors and how sleeping in these dwellings can be a great educational discourse for us. If you have any further questions or comments, put them in our in the block. We will get back to you as quickly as we can. We thank you so very much for joining us for this episode of Conversations at Noon on the Freedom Trail. Next month, we will have our year in review where myself, the chairman of the Freedom Trail, and the coordinator, Charles Warner Jr. and Todd Levine, the three of us will get together and we will talk up the adventures that happened on the Freedom Trail throughout this year. And then Tuesday, January 23rd on the Conversations at Noon, the Black Heritage Project at the Connecticut State Community College, Capital College, with Dr. Frank Mitchell, Professor Antoinette Brimbell, and Dr. Duncan Harris will be our guests for the beginning of the new year on Conversations at Noon. So until the next time, everyone. Woo!